The Yucatan doesn't just grow, it breathes. The humidity was a physical weight, a wet wool blanket that smelled of rotting orchids and ancient damp stone. We had been hacking through the overgrowth for 6 days, following a coordinate set that shouldn't have existed on any modern satellite map. "We're close," Commander Rios grunted. He wiped a mixture of sweat and insect repellent from his forehead with the back of a tactical glove. "GPS is flickering, but the magnetic variance is off the charts. Something big is just over this ridge." I adjusted the strap of my pack, my fingers tracing the edge of my linguistics kit. I was here to translate the untranslatable, symbols found on a shard of black glass recovered from a black market dig. Beside me, Dr. Eris was muttering to himself, his skin pale despite the heat. "The architecture. It's wrong, Leo," Eris whispered to me. "The Aztecs didn't use volcanic glass this far south, and the dates on that shard, they predate the Olmecs. This shouldn't be here." We broke through a wall of ferns and stopped dead. The ground simply ended. Ahead of us was a perfectly circular sinkhole, a cenote, but it wasn't filled with water. It was a crater of shadows, 300 feet across. Rising from the center like a jagged tooth emerging from a gum was the top of a pyramid. It wasn't made of limestone. It was crafted from obsidian, so polished it looked like a frozen lake stood on its side. "Look!" Rios pointed. Near the edge of the descent, propped against a gnarled ceiba tree, was a suit of armor. It was Spanish, 16th century, rusted into a skeletal orange cage. Inside the breastplate sat a skull, its jaw unhinged as if in a final silent scream. Clutched in its bony fingers was a piece of stiff, dried animal hide. I knelt beside the remains, my heart hammering. I gently pried the hide from the skeleton's grip. It wasn't a map. It was a list, written in a shaky, frantic Latin that looked like it had been scratched with a dagger. "What does it say, Leo?" Rios asked, his hand hovering over his sidearm. I cleared my throat, my voice sounding small against the sudden silence of the jungle. "It's a warning. He calls it the directive of the uncounted." I began to translate out loud. 1. Do not count the steps as you descend. If you reach a number divisible by 13, stop and wait for the echoes to catch up. 2. The sun is a liar here. If you see a shaft of light hitting the floor, do not step into it. It is not sunlight. It is a weight. 3. If you hear the sound of a stone heart beating, hum a low note. You must drown out the rhythm, or your own heart will try to match it. 4. Look at your shadow every 10 minutes. If it has more than 2 arms, do not turn around. Walk backward until the extra limbs vanish. 5. If you find a room filled with gold, do not touch it. It isn't gold. It is the skin of those who came before you. 6. If you reach the central altar and the priest is standing there, do not speak. Give him your name, but do not use your voice. Rios let out a sharp, cynical breath. Superstitious nonsense. The guy probably died of malaria and spent his last hours hallucinating. He didn't die of malaria, Commander, Eris said, his voice trembling. He pointed at the skeleton. I looked closer. The conquistador's bones weren't white. They were translucent, turning into the same black glass as the temple. And where his heart should have been, a small, jagged stone was fused to his ribs. "He didn't die," Eris whispered. "He changed." Rios ignored him and kicked a flare into the dark maw of the temple entrance. "We have a job to do. Move out. And Eris, keep your mouth shut. No counting." We began the descent. The air inside the temple was impossibly cold, the temperature dropping 40 degrees the moment we crossed the threshold. The obsidian walls reflected our headlamps in 1,000 directions, creating a dizzying hall of mirrors. I looked at the floor. The stairs were narrow, steep, and slick. 1, 2, 3. I caught myself. I clamped my jaw shut, forcing the numbers back into the dark corners of my mind. But as we descended deeper into the earth, I realized the jungle sounds had vanished. There was no wind, no insects, just the sound of our boots on the glass. Clack, clack, clack. And then I heard a fourth sound, an extra footfall that didn't belong to any of us. It was heavy, wet, and followed a half-second behind our own. "Rios," I whispered. "Don't look back." I checked my watch. It had been 10 minutes. I looked at the floor where my shadow was cast by Rios's light. My shadow was standing perfectly still, even though I was moving. And it was slowly raising a third, elongated arm toward my throat. Chapter 2. The Descending Dark. The obsidian stairs felt like walking down the throat of a great frozen beast. The walls were so polished that our headlamps didn't illuminate the path. They created a blinding, fractured world of white light and absolute shadow. Every time I moved, a dozen versions of me moved in the glass, stretching away into an infinite dark distance. "Stay close," Rios commanded. His voice, usually a bark of authority, was muffled here, as if the walls were drinking the sound. "And for God's sake, keep your eyes on the person in front of you." I tried to obey, but the shadow rule was a physical itch in the back of my mind. I kept my chin tucked, glancing down at the dark silhouette cast against the steps. My shadow was no longer a perfect mimic. It was sluggish, trailing behind my movements by a fraction of a second. And the third arm, that long, spindly limb, was now joined by a fourth, both of them reaching out from my shadow's torso like the legs of a spider. I stopped. I didn't turn around. I simply took a step backward, then another, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Leo, what are you doing?" Eris hissed. He was behind me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "The shadow," I whispered, my eyes locked on the floor. "Back up, Eris, now." We shuffled backward like penance seekers for 3 agonizing steps. On the third step, the extra limbs on my shadow flickered and snapped back into the main trunk of the silhouette. The shadow was mine again. "It's just a trick of the light," Eris muttered. Though his hands were shaking so hard, he had to grip the strap of his pack to keep from dropping it. "Refraction. Total internal reflection. The obsidian is acting like a prism." He was trying to use science as a shield, but the shield was paper thin. He began to move faster, his breathing coming in shallow, jagged gasps. He was terrified of the silence. He was terrified of the dark. And in that terror, he fell back on the most basic human instinct for order. He began to count. 1, 2, 3, he whispered. Eris, shut up! I snapped, grabbing his shoulder. He jerked away, his eyes glazed. I have to know how deep we are, Leo. If I know the depth, I can calculate the pressure. I can calculate the exit. 12, 13. The word 13 didn't leave his lips so much as it was pulled from them. The moment the syllable hit the air, the stairs beneath us vanished. Not physically, I could still see them, but the perspective shifted. The staircase, which had seemed to descend another 50 feet, suddenly stretched into a mile-long ribbon of black glass. The walls moved outward, expanding until we were standing on a narrow ledge in a void so vast our headlamps couldn't find the ceiling. And then the echoes arrived. 13, 13, 13. The voices weren't Oris's. They were a chorus of whispers, thousands of them, repeating the number in a dozen different languages. Latin, Spanish, a harsh, glottal tongue that I recognized as an archaic form of Nahuatl. Wait for the echoes to catch up. I remembered the rule. Rios, stop. Don't move. Rios ignored me. He had his rifle raised, scanning the dark. Something's moving out there. Movement at 6 o'clock. He fired a burst. The muzzle flashes lit up the void for a microsecond. In that flash, I saw them. They were perched on the edges of the obsidian ribbon, figures that looked like men, but their skin was the same polished black as the walls. They had no eyes, only deep vertical slits, and they were crouched like vultures waiting. They're waiting for the number, I screamed. The echoes intensified, the word 13 becoming a roar that vibrated the very glass we stood on. Eris was on his knees, hands over his ears, sobbing. 26, he screamed, trying to drown them out. 26, 39. Every time he shouted a multiple of 13, the obsidian beneath us groaned. Fissures appeared in the glass, glowing with a faint, sickly purple light. The figures in the dark began to crawl closer, their long, glass-like fingers clicking against the stairs. Click, click, click. Rios, we have to stay still. I grabbed the commander's tactical vest, pulling him back. The rule, wait for the echoes. We stood frozen. Aris was still counting, but the echoes were catching up to him, overlapping his voice until the sound became a solid wall of noise. The black figures were only feet away now, their scent hitting me, a smell of old ozone and dried blood. Then, the noise stopped. The echoes reached the current moment. The silence that followed was so heavy it made my ears bleed. The staircase snapped back to its original dimensions. The void vanished. We were back in a narrow corridor of obsidian, the exit just 20 feet above us. But Aris was gone. In his place sat a pile of black volcanic sand, and resting on top of the sand was his glasses, the lenses perfectly intact, reflecting the beam of my headlamp. He counted, Rios whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't wait. I looked at the walls. A new carving was forming in the glass, the stone weeping a dark, thick sap. It was a face, Eris's face, frozen in the moment of his final count. Don't look at it, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. We have to keep going. We haven't reached the light yet. Chapter 3. The Weight of Light. Rios didn't mourn Aris. He couldn't afford to. He simply adjusted his pack, checked the action on his rifle, and stepped over the pile of black sand that used to be our historian. His eyes were hard, fixed on the path ahead, but I saw the tremor in his hands. "The light is changing," he muttered. He was right. The oppressive ink-black darkness of the upper tunnels was being pushed back by a faint golden radiance. It wasn't the flickering of a torch or the artificial white of our LED headlamps. It was a thick, honey-colored glow that seemed to pour around the corners like a liquid. We turned a sharp, 90-degree bend and stopped. The corridor opened into a vast circular chamber. The ceiling was a domed expanse of obsidian, but it was pierced by 3 perfect vertical shafts. Through these holes, beams of sunlight fell to the floor. It looked like paradise. After the freezing cold and the crushing shadows, the golden beams were a siren song. They illuminated the dust motes in the air, making them look like floating flecks of gold. The floor where the light hit was brilliant, shining with a metallic luster that made my eyes ache. "Is that actual sun?" Rios asked. He took a step forward, his face bathed in the reflected glow. "We're under a sinkhole. It must be noon. The sun is directly overhead." He began to move toward the nearest beam. It was a wide shaft of gold, landing directly in the center of the path we needed to take to reach the far door. Rule 2. The sun is a liar here. It is not sunlight. It is a weight. "Rios, wait!" I lunged for him, grabbing the strap of his harness. "Look at the floor where the light hits." Rios paused, frowning. He looked at the spot of gold. At first, it just looked like a bright patch of stone. But as I directed my headlamp toward it, I saw the truth. The obsidian floor didn't just reflect the light. It was indented. The solid glass was bowed downward in a perfect circle, as if a massive lead weight were resting on it. Near the edge of the beam lay a discarded machete. One Rios must have dropped earlier. Half of the blade was in the shadow. The other half was in the light. The half in the light wasn't just bright. It was flat. The steel had been crushed into a leaf of metal no thicker than a sheet of paper, fused into the obsidian floor. "It's not a shadow," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's a column of pressure." Rios pulled back, his face turning pale. "If I had stepped in there, you would have been part of the flooring," I finished. We looked around the room. There were dozens of these golden patches on the floor. Now that my eyes were adjusted, I realized they weren't just decorative. They were shaped like things. One patch had the distinct silhouette of a jaguar, flattened into a 2-dimensional gold leaf. Another looked like a human hand, fingers splayed in a final, desperate reach. "How do we get across?" Rios asked, his voice low. "The beams are moving." He was right. As the celestial bodies above shifted, or as the temple itself rotated, the shafts of light were crawling across the floor with the slow, inevitable pace of a clockie's hand. We began a frantic, terrifying dance. We moved in the gaps, our eyes glued to the floor, watching the edges of the gold. The air near the beams was hot, not the warmth of the sun, but the heat of friction. The sound of the atmosphere being compressed into a diamond-hard pillar. The sound was low at first, but it grew into a mechanical hum. The light was moving faster now. One beam swept toward us, cutting off our retreat. Another was swinging around from the right, pinning us against a wall of obsidian. "The door," I pointed. The exit was 30 feet away, but a beam of light was currently parked right in front of the threshold. "We have to jump it," Rios said, his military pragmatism returning. "If we time the swing..." "You can't jump a weight like that, Rios. If even your heel catches it, it'll pull your whole body down." Suddenly, a third beam dropped from the ceiling, directly behind us. We were trapped in a shrinking triangle of shadow. The floor began to groan under the collective tonnage of the light. "Leo, look!" Rios shouted. He pointed to a series of mirrors, obsidian discs polished to a high sheen, mounted on pivoting stone pillars around the room. "The light is a liar," I repeated the rule. "It's not just a weight, it's a tool." I ran to the nearest pillar. It was freezing to the touch. I put my weight against it, the stone groaning as it turned. I tilted the obsidian disc into the path of the approaching beam. The moment the light hit the mirror, the weight shifted. The pillar didn't just reflect the glow, it buckled. The stone base cracked, and the mirror began to hum with a violent, vibrating energy. But the beam was diverted. It shot sideways, hitting the far wall with a sound like a cannon blast, shattering the obsidian into 1,000 black diamonds. "Go now!" I screamed. We bolted through the gap I had created. We reached the far door just as the beams converged on the center of the room. There was a sickening, wet crunch, the sound of the very air being pulverized. We slammed the stone door behind us, plunging ourselves back into the merciful dark. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air. My skin was stinging. I looked at my arms. Where the reflected golden glow had touched me, my skin was turning yellow. Not the yellow of a bruise, but the deep metallic luster of 24-karat gold. I touched my forearm. It didn't feel like flesh. It felt like cold, hard metal. "Leo," Rios whispered from the darkness. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the floor. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. The stone heart had started to beat. Chapter 4. The Heart in the Walls. The sound didn't come from a single direction. It was subterranean and atmospheric all at once. A wet, heavy thud that made the obsidian floor beneath our boots jump. Thump, thump. The interval was long, maybe 5 seconds of agonizing silence, followed by a double beat that felt like a physical punch to the solar plexus. "My chest," Rios gasped, dropping his rifle. He clutched at his tactical vest, his face twisting into a mask of pure agony. "Leo, my heart, it's skipping." I felt it too. My pulse, usually a frantic light tapping in my neck, was being forcibly realigned. Every time the tempo beat, my own heart would stall, waiting for the stone to give it permission to continue. It was a terrifying, stuttering rhythm. Rule 3. If you hear the sound of a stone heart beating, hum a low note. You must drown out the rhythm, or your own heart will try to match it. "Rios, I shouted, but my voice was thin, robbed of its power by the encroaching vibration. I took a deep breath, pushing past the gold-stiffened skin on my ribs, and let out a low, guttural drone. The sound vibrated in my sinuses, a tiny, buzzing shield against the mountain's pulse. It felt ridiculous, a man humming against the weight of an ancient god. But as the resonance filled my skull, the crushing pressure on my chest eased. My heart found its own path again, a frantic but independent rhythm. "Rios, match me!" I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. Rios was turning blue. His heart had locked into the temple's cycle. He was waiting for the next beat, his body a captive to the stone. Thump, thump. The sound was louder now. Dust shook from the ceiling. A crack appeared in the obsidian wall, and for a split second, I saw what was behind the glass. It wasn't earth or rock. It was a massive, wet, red-gray muscle the size of a house, glistening with a thick, translucent bile. The temple wasn't a building. It was a rib cage. Damn you, I roared. And then I began to sing, not a song, but a single, continuous note, a low, vibrating growl that I forced from the very bottom of my lungs. Rios finally caught the frequency. He let out a ragged, desperate moan that eventually settled into a steady hum. We stood there in the dark, two men vibrating like tuning forks, while the temple's heart tried to shatter us. We began to move, shuffling down the corridor, never letting the hum falter. If I stopped to inhale, Rios held the note. If he faltered, I increased my volume. It was a symphony of survival. As we moved deeper, the walls changed. The obsidian was no longer smooth. It was covered in carvings that moved in time with the heartbeat. I saw a calendar, the Tonalpohualli, but the day signs weren't static. They were screaming. The flint knife, the skull, the jaguar. They were all twisting in a slow, agonizing dance of stone. "Leo," Rios groaned between hums. "Look at the shadows." I glanced down. Our headlamps were flickering, dying under the electromagnetic pulse of the heart. In the strobing light, our shadows were massive. They didn't have forearms anymore. They had hundreds. They looked like feathered serpents coiling around our feet, their limbs merging with the cracks in the floor. My shadow's head was no longer human. It was a wide, flat obsidian mask with a tongue made of golden leaf. "Don't look at them," I warned. "Focus on the sound. Focus on the exit." We reached a set of massive jade doors. They were translucent, glowing with a faint internal rot. There were no handles, only two indentations in the shape of human hands. Rule 5. If you find a room filled with gold, do not touch it. It isn't gold. It is the skin of those who came before you. The room beyond the jade doors was blinding. Even through the cracks in the stone, I could see the glint of 1,000 treasures. Statues, coins, breastplates, all of it shimmering with a rich, buttery light. "Gold," Rios whispered, his hum dying away in awe. "Leo, look at the hoard. We could buy the world." He reached for the jade door. His hand, already stiffening with the gold plague, moved toward the hand-shaped indentation. "Rio, stop! Look at the statues!" I pointed my dying headlamp into the room. The statues weren't carvings of gods. They were men. One was wearing a conquistador's helmet. Another was wearing a tattered 1920s expedition jacket. A third was wearing a modern tactical vest, exactly like Rios's. They weren't made of gold. They were gold. Their skin had become the metal, their eyes replaced by raw emeralds, their poses forever frozen in the moment they reached for the treasure. "It's a trap," I whispered. "The gold isn't the reward. It's the waste product. It's what happens when the heart finishes with you." The heartbeat suddenly doubled in speed. Thump, 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 thump. The temple was excited. It wanted us to touch the door. It wanted to finish the harvest. "We have to go through," Rios said, his voice now a metallic rasp. He looked at his hand. It was solid gold up to the elbow. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. "The only way out is through the altar room. If I'm going to become a statue, I'm going to do it while moving." He slammed his golden shoulder against the jade doors. They didn't swing open. They dissolved into a fine green mist. We stepped into the room of gold, and the air turned into liquid fire. Chapter 5. The Transformation. The air in the room of gold didn't just feel hot. It felt heavy, like breathing through a veil of molten silk. The moment we crossed the threshold, the humming that had protected our hearts was drowned out by a sound more insidious, the sound of 1,000 whispering coins. Clink, clink, clink. It wasn't money. It was the sound of our own cells crystallizing. I looked at my arm. The gold plague had moved past my elbow. It wasn't a coating on top of my skin. My skin was being replaced. The fine hairs on my arm were now delicate wires of spun gold. My veins were ridges of copper. When I flexed my hand, the sound wasn't the soft movement of muscle, but the dry, metallic groan of a hinge that needed oil. "Leo." Rios's voice was a flat, tonal chime. He was standing in the center of the treasure pile, but he wasn't looking at the coins. He was staring at the wall. The obsidian there had become a mirror, but it didn't show the room as it was. It showed the room as it had been 500 years ago. In the reflection, Rios wasn't wearing his tactical gear. He was draped in a cloak of quetzal feathers, his face painted with a horizontal stripe of black soot. Behind him, I saw myself. I was wearing a headdress of jade and gold, holding a knife made of smoking mirror. "I remember this," Rios whispered. His eyes, once a sharp military brown, were turning into flat, unblinking citrine. "I remember the scent of the copal incense. I remember the taste of the ceremonial cacao. I've been here before, Leo. We both have." "No," I gasped, clutching my head. My memories were fraying at the edges. I tried to think of my apartment in Chicago, the smell of the subway, the sound of my sister's voice on the phone. But those memories felt like a movie I had watched a long time ago. Replacing them were images of a blood-stained sun, the sound of a drum made of human skin, the feeling of the cold obsidian steps beneath bare feet. The temple wasn't just taking our bodies, it was reclaiming its staff. "The rules," I choked out, the word rules feeling like a foreign object in my mouth. Rule 4, the shadow. I looked down. In the brilliant golden light of the room, my shadow was stark. It was no longer a feathered serpent. It was a man, a priest, with his chest cracked open. He was holding a stone heart that beat in perfect synchronization with the temple. The shadow reached out and touched Rios's shadow. Rios let out a high, melodic scream as his legs fused together. The gold raced up his torso, turning his tactical vest into a breastplate of solid, ornate metal. His rifle fell from his stiffening fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Before it even stopped bouncing, the gun began to change, the steel softening into wood, the polymer grip turning into a row of obsidian teeth. It was no longer a firearm. It was a macuahuitl. "Rios, fight it!" I tried to grab him, but my own fingers were too stiff. I couldn't bend them. "Why fight? The inevitable?" Rios asked. His jaw was the last thing to go. He turned his head toward me, a slow, mechanical movement. "The calendar must turn, Leo. The uncounted must be counted." He became a statue, a perfect golden soldier of a forgotten empire, his face frozen in a look of divine ecstasy. I was alone. The gold was at my throat now. I could feel it tightening, a cold, heavy collar that made every breath a labor. My lungs felt like they were being lined with foil. I looked toward the far end of the room. There was no door, only a curtain of falling water that glowed with a pale, bioluminescent blue. Rule 6. If you reach the central altar and the priest is standing there, do not speak. Give him your name, but do not use your voice. I realized then that the priest wasn't a ghost or a god. It was a vacancy. I moved toward the water, my movements clanking and heavy. Each step was a battle against the weight of my own changing body. My mind was a battlefield. One half was a 21st century linguist screaming in terror. The other half was a Tlamakaskwi, a servant of the smoking mirror, coming home after a long journey through the dark. I stepped through the curtain of water. The cold hit me like a physical blow, temporarily halting the spread of the gold. I stood in a small circular chamber. In the center was a monolithic altar of black glass. Standing behind the altar was a figure. He was dressed in tattered rags that might have been a business suit 100 years ago. His skin was the color of a bruised plum, and his eyes were missing, replaced by two perfectly round, polished hematite spheres. He held a knife of obsidian in one hand and a stylus in the other. He was waiting. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He was the previous priest, and he looked exhausted. I walked to the altar. The gold reached my chin. I had 1 minute left of being human. 1 minute to decide if I was the sacrifice or the successor. Chapter 6. Revelation. The priest did not speak, but the air around him vibrated with the weight of 1 billion forgotten seconds. As I approached the altar, the gold plague reached my lower lip. I could no longer taste the salt of my sweat or the metallic tang of the chamber. I could only taste the cold, indifferent purity of the metal. The figure behind the altar, the man in the tattered suit, tilted his head. The hematite spheres in his sockets caught the blue light of the water curtain, reflecting my own golden face back at me. He held out the stylus. It wasn't a pen. It was a splinter of bone, sharpened to a needle point, stained with the ink of centuries. Rule 6. Give him your name, but do not use your voice. I understood now. To speak a name is to give it breath, to let it vibrate in the air of the living. To give a name without a voice is to etch it into the stone, to tether your soul to the architecture of the temple. The priest reached out and grabbed my golden hand. His grip was surprisingly warm, the only warm thing in this frozen tomb. He turned my palm upward. With the stylus, he began to carve into the gold of my skin. He didn't write Leo. He wrote a series of dots and bars, the long count notation of the Maya, the mathematical language of the Aztecs. He was translating my life into a number. Every heartbeat I had ever had, every word I had ever spoken, every person I had ever loved was being condensed into a single cosmic sum. As he carved, the revelation flooded my mind. The temple wasn't a tomb for the dead. It was a gyroscope for time. The world outside, the cities, the forests, the oceans, existed only because this heart continued to beat. Time is not a natural river. It is a machine that requires maintenance. The uncounted were the gears. Every few centuries, the friction of reality wore down the current priest, and the temple needed a fresh source of duration to keep the gears turning. If the heart stopped, time would not just end. It would collapse into a single frozen moment. The sun would stop in the sky. The rain would hang in the air like glass. Mothers would be frozen in mid-breath over their children. I wasn't a victim of a curse. I was the new battery for the universe. The priest finished the final stroke on my palm. He looked at me, and for a second, the hematite spheres seemed to soften. He leaned in, his dry, papery lips brushing against the golden shell of my ear. "I am Eris," he didn't say, but the thought appeared in my head. I was Eris. I was the conquistador. I was the boy who watched the stars from the top of the Great Pyramid. Now I am just the silence between the beats. Thank you for coming, Leo. I am so very tired. He handed me the obsidian knife. The gold reached my eyes. The world turned into a shimmering yellow haze. I felt the last of my human memories, the smell of Chicago rain, the feel of a steering wheel being pulled out of me like silk threads. They were being woven into the walls of the temple, becoming part of the gold that paved the floors. The previous priest stepped back. His violet plum-colored skin began to flake away. He wasn't turning into a statue. He was turning into dust. He had been used up. Every second of his life had been burned to keep the world moving. He vanished into a pile of gray ash, which the wind of the heartbeat immediately scattered into the dark. I stood behind the altar. I picked up the stylus. My body was now entirely solid gold, but I could move. I moved with a heavy, grinding grace. I felt the heart of the temple beneath my feet. It was my heart now. Thump, thump. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a clock ticked. A child was born. A wave hit a shore. They did these things because I was standing here, holding the knife. But then I heard it. The sound of a machete hacking through ferns. The sound of a radio crackling with static. Station 1 to recovery team. We have a visual on the sinkhole. It's massive. We're moving in to retrieve the linguist and the security team. Over. The special recovery team had arrived. Fresh duration, new gears. I looked at the obsidian wall beside the altar. It was blank, waiting for the 7th rule. My hand moved automatically. I didn't write for them. I wrote for the thing I used to be. The gold had finally claimed my face, but it didn't feel like a mask. It felt like my true skin. Through my hematite eyes, which had grown into the sockets the moment the previous priest dissolved, the world was no longer a collection of objects. It was a flow of energy. I saw the heat of the jungle above leaking down through the vents. I saw the cold, blue vibration of the water curtain. And I saw the approaching recovery team as a cluster of frantic, flickering candles in the dark. They were loud. They were messy. They were full of time. And they were spending it with every panicked breath. I looked at the obsidian wall. The surface was smooth, a dark mirror reflecting the eternal golden glow of the chamber. My hand, heavy and precise, reached out. I didn't need a chisel. My fingernails were now blades of black glass, sharper than any surgical tool. I began to carve. I didn't write in Latin or English. I wrote in the language of the temple, a series of glyphs that pulsed with their own internal light. But as I carved, the meaning echoed in the minds of anyone who would ever stand where I stood. 7. Do not pity the priest. He is the only one who knows how long the second lasts. As the final stroke was completed, the temple let out a long, resonant hum. The gold on the floors brightened. The statues of the previous explorers shifted slightly, their metallic joints settling into new positions. The trap was reset. The calendar was wound. The first member of the recovery team burst through the jade doors. He was young, wearing a high-tech tactical helmet with a built-in HUD. He stopped dead, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the room, reflecting off the mountains of gold. "Jesus," he whispered. "Command, this is Miller. You're not going to believe this. The whole place, it's a treasury. We found the motherlode." I stood perfectly still behind the altar. To him, I was just another statue, a particularly ornate one, draped in shadows and glowing with an eerie internal light. He didn't see the way the obsidian knife in my hand vibrated. He didn't see the gold dust swirling around my feet. "Wait," Miller said, his voice dropping. "I see a figure behind the altar. It looks like a priest." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the golden scales of the floor. He was ignoring the rules. He wasn't humming. He wasn't checking his shadow. He was already counting the value of the room in his head. 1 million, 10 million, a billion. The temple's heart gave a violent, joyful thump-thump. Miller gasped, clutching his chest. "My heart. Command. I think the air is thin down here. I'm feeling lightheaded." "Stay calm, Miller." A voice crackled in his ear. "We're right behind you." I watched him. I felt the hunger of the stone beneath my feet, the way the temple reached out for his vitality. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him to turn back, to run into the green hell and never look back. But my mouth was a fixed golden line. And besides, if he left, who would hold the knife when I was used up? Who would keep the sun in the sky for the people I used to know? Miller reached the edge of the altar. He looked into my hematite eyes. For a second, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He saw the linguist buried beneath the gold. "Leo," he whispered. I didn't speak. I didn't use my voice. I simply tapped the stylus against the stone, a rhythmic, metallic click that signaled the start of his first hour. The water curtain behind me flared blue. the shadows began to grow extra limbs, and somewhere, far above in the world of the living, the sun continued to rise, unaware of the price being paid in the dark to keep it moving. I closed my eyes, not my physical ones, but the eyes of my soul, and began to listen to the rhythm of the world. The watch had begun.